His signal came without warning. It appeared on every screen, every radio, every communication device on the planet at exactly the same moment. It did not matter where a person was, in a quiet village in Nigeria, on a fishing boat in the Pacific, in a subway car under New York City. Every device that could receive a signal received it. The sound it made was a low, steady tone, and then, after 3 seconds, the tone stopped, and a voice began to speak. The voice was calm. It was not human. It spoke in a language no one on Earth had ever heard, but somehow, within minutes, linguists at a dozen universities were already noting that the words had a clear structure, a clear grammar, and a rhythm that felt almost familiar. Automated translation systems that governments had built for classified purposes, systems designed to handle unknown languages, began working on it immediately. Within 2 hours, the first rough translation was ready. Within 4 hours, a cleaner version was being read aloud in emergency rooms, government bunkers, and living rooms all over the world. The message was from something that called itself the Galactic Council of Sovereign Species. It said that the Council had been watching Earth for a long time. It said that humanity had now reached a point in its development where it could no longer be left outside the Council's administrative framework. It said that the Council was not an enemy. It said that the Council was, in fact, a friend, and that the terms it was about to offer were generous, fair, and in the best interests of the human species. Colonel Diana Cole read the full translated document alone in a small conference room at the United Nations Emergency Coordination Center in New York. The room smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights above her flickered once and then stayed on. She read the document from the first line to the last, and then she read it again. It was 47 pages long. When she finished the second reading, she put it face down on the table, picked up her cold coffee, and drank it. The terms were written in polite, careful language, but the meaning underneath the politeness was not polite at all. Earth would become what the Council called a provisional member civilization. Humans could keep their governments and their languages and their music and their holidays. But every government on Earth would have to operate within a set of rules written by the Council's Regulatory Bureau. The rules were attached as an appendix. The appendix was longer than the main document. All of Earth's military forces, every army, every navy, every air force, every missile, would be dissolved. They would be replaced by a small peacekeeping force of 10,000 soldiers, lightly armed, who would answer not to any human authority, but to the Council. Humanity's nuclear weapons, which had been the most powerful tools of deterrence ever built by human hands, would be handed over within 90 days. Failure to comply would be treated as a hostile act. Any resource that Earth wanted to take from space, minerals from asteroids, gases from other planets, or anything beyond Earth's own atmosphere, would require a license from a company chartered by the Council. 80% of whatever was earned from those resources would go to something the document called Galactic Infrastructure Maintenance. The remaining 20% would go to Earth, to be distributed according to a plan that also had to be approved by the Council. Humanity would not be allowed to develop faster-than-light travel on its own. It would not be allowed to build artificial intelligence above a level the document defined in precise technical terms. It would not be allowed to build any weapon above a certain yield. Any of these things required an application, a review, and an authorization. The review period was 50 years. In exchange for all of this, the Council offered 3 things. First, a protection from any species in the galaxy that might wish to harm Earth, though the document noted, almost as a footnote, that no such species currently presented an active threat. Second, access to certain medical technologies that the Council deemed appropriate for Earth's current level of development. Third, a guarantee that no Council member world would interfere in human affairs, as long as human affairs remained within the boundaries the Council had defined. Lieutenant Commander Paul Warren knocked on the conference room door and stepped inside. He was Diana's intelligence liaison, a lean man in his early 40s with dark eyes and the particular face of someone who had not slept in a long time. He looked at her. She looked at him. "They're ships," she said. "Where are they?" "3 vessels," Paul said. We tracked them entering the outer solar system about 6 hours ago. Best estimate puts them 11 days from Earth orbit at their current speed." Diana was quiet for a moment. 11 days? She said again, more to herself than to him. "They're waiting for an acknowledgement," Paul said. "A formal response. They haven't specified a deadline, but the message implies they expect one within the next 24 hours. Diana stood up. She picked up the document and held it in both hands for a second, then set it back down. 11 days, she said for the 3rd time, and now there was something in her voice that Paul had not heard before. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was the sound of a person doing very fast math in their head. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," she said. "Get me the Secretary General. And get me every head of state who is currently awake and willing to talk. I don't care what time it is where they are." She moved toward the door. "And get me the translation team. I want every word of this document checked again. I want to know if there is anything in here that the first pass missed." Paul was already on his phone. "What are we telling the public?" "Nothing yet," Diana said. "Not until we know what we're doing." She paused at the doorway. "The council says these terms are generous. I want to understand exactly what they think we should be grateful for." She walked out into the hallway, and behind her, through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, the sky was just beginning to get light. It was a normal sky, blue at the edges, fading to gray, and it looked, for the moment, exactly the same as it had always looked. But in 11 days, 3 ships larger than any building humanity had ever constructed would be hanging above that sky, and the council would be waiting for an answer. Diana Cole did not intend to give them the one they were expecting. HFY found out about the message on the morning of the 2nd day. There was no official announcement. A leaked translation appeared online, and within 40 minutes it had been read by more people than any document in human history. The reaction was immediate and loud. There were protests in the streets of a dozen cities. There was panic buying in supermarkets. There were religious gatherings on public squares, people standing in circles and praying or singing or simply holding each other. There were also, in offices and laboratories and government buildings all over the planet, a very different kind of reaction. People sat down, rolled up their sleeves, and started working. What happened in those 11 days was not clean or organized. It was not a single plan carried out by a single authority. It was more like a fire. It started in many places at once, and it spread in directions that no one had planned, and by the time it was done, it had covered ground that no one had thought possible. The first thing that happened was that enemies started talking to each other. Nations that had not shared intelligence in decades, that had, in some cases, spent years actively working against each other, began sending messages and files and personnel across borders that had seemed completely closed the week before. And it was not that the old suspicions disappeared. They did not. But the Council's message had introduced something new into the calculation, a threat that was external to all of them, and that treated every human nation with exactly the same indifference. In the face of that, old rivalries became less interesting. Dr. Calvin Osei had been working on a theoretical faster-than-light drive for 11 years at the European Space Agency. The work was real, but it was also, by his own honest assessment, far from complete. He had pieces of a theory. He had mathematics that pointed in a direction without yet arriving anywhere. On the 3rd day after the message, his phone began ringing with calls from people he had never met: physicists, engineers, and propulsion researchers from India, China, the United States, Brazil, and South Korea, all of whom had been working on similar problems in isolation. They had pieces, too, different pieces. Within 48 hours, Calvin and 6 of these strangers were working together in a temporary facility outside Brussels. They argued constantly. They disagreed about almost everything. But the arguments were productive in a way that Calvin's solitary work had never been, because the disagreements revealed assumptions that each of them had been carrying without realizing it. By the 5th day, the drive was still not functional. It was, however, no longer only theoretical. There were components on a table, there were tests being run, and there was a result, not a complete result, but a result, that none of them had had before. "It doesn't need to work," said Grace Liu, a propulsion engineer from Shanghai who had become, and in the space of 4 days, one of the most important people in Calvin's life. "It just needs to be real enough that they can't dismiss it." General Aaron Bridges was the senior military officer on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man who had spent 30 years preparing for conflicts with other human nations. He was now preparing for something very different, and he was doing it in a way that surprised his staff. He was not moving fleets or hardening missile installations. Instead, he had ordered a full accounting, a complete, honest, and classified inventory of everything Earth could do that the Council might not have expected. This included the conventional military forces, which were large and well-equipped, but it also included things that were harder to categorize. Cyber warfare tools that had never been deployed at their full scale. A research into biological and chemical systems that existed only in files. And a collection of programs whose names were known only to a very small group of people. Programs that had been developed in the margins of black budgets for decades. Programs whose purpose was to be ready for the unknown. "We are not going to start a war," Aaron told his staff on the 6th day, his voice flat and certain. "But when we sit across the table from them, they should look at us and feel something they are not used to feeling. They should feel uncertainty. We need to be the thing they cannot calculate." The diplomatic work fell to a woman named Carol Nash. She was 63 years old, originally from a small town in North Carolina, and she had spent most of her adult life in rooms where people were trying to kill each other. Not with weapons, but with words, with money, with leverage, with the slow pressure of time. She had negotiated a ceasefire in a conflict that had been running for 40 years. She had convinced 3 groups, each of whom believed the others were fundamentally evil, to sit in the same room and write an agreement that all 3 could accept. She was the best at what she did, and what she did was understand what people were actually afraid of. She spent the first 4 days reading everything that was known about the Council, which was not much, but was not nothing. The message had come with a great deal of data embedded in its transmission. Data that the Council had clearly intended as background information. Carol read all of it, and she paid particular attention to the Council's history of contact operations, the 47 civilizations it had previously incorporated into its framework. She noted the pattern. She noted that every single one of those civilizations had accepted the Council's terms within a period of months. She noted that none of them had pushed back in any serious way. On the 8th day, the leaders of 11 nations signed a joint declaration. It was the first document of its kind, not a treaty, not an alliance, but a simple shared statement. It said that humanity had reviewed the Council's terms and did not accept them. It said that humanity was prepared to negotiate a different arrangement. It was sent back on every frequency the Council had used, in the same translated galactic standard that the Council's own message had been written in. And the last paragraph was Carol's. She had written it in the middle of the night, sitting in a hotel room in Geneva with a glass of water and the light of her laptop screen, and she had not changed a word of it in the morning. It said, "We are a young species, and we have survived things that should have killed us. We would like to continue surviving. We hope the Council shares this preference." Paul Warren read the declaration on his phone, and then found Diana in a hallway and showed it to her. She read it twice, the same way she had read the Council's original message. Then she handed the phone back to him. "Good," she said. Now we wait and see if they understand what it means." Outside, the sky was dark, and somewhere above it, 3 enormous ships were still moving toward Earth at a steady speed. And they had not responded to the declaration. They had not changed course. They were simply coming, calm and certain, the way something comes when it has never been told no and does not believe that today will be different. They had 5 days left. Humanity had 5 days left, and in 5 days both sides would sit down across from each other, and the conversation that would decide what kind of future the human species was going to have would finally begin. 3 ships entered orbit on a Tuesday morning. They did not announce their arrival. They did not respond to the hailing frequencies that Diana's team had been broadcasting every 6 hours for 2 days. They simply appeared in the sky above the planet. 3 dark shapes, each one longer than any bridge or building humanity had ever made. And they stayed there, sitting in low orbit, doing nothing, saying nothing. People on the ground could see them with the naked eye just after sunset, 3 slow points of reflected light moving in a line from west to east. In the cities directly below their orbital path, people stood on rooftops and sidewalks and stared up. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were angry. Some of them were just very quiet, the way people get quiet when something happens that is too large to fit inside a normal feeling. Diana Cole spent the first 2 hours of the ship's arrival in a monitoring room, watching satellite feeds and listening to the silence on the hailing frequencies. The ships were not doing anything threatening. They were not moving into firing positions or scanning the surface in any way that the monitoring systems could detect. They were waiting. Diana understood waiting. Yeah, she had used it herself many times. You wait because it sends a message. You wait because it makes the other side uncomfortable, and discomfort can be a useful tool. She did not allow herself to be made uncomfortable. She had Paul send a simple, short message on the same frequency. "We are ready to begin talks at your convenience. We await your response." Then she went and ate breakfast and came back. 6 hours after the ships arrived, a response came. It was not a long message. It said that the Council's primary diplomatic representative, Ambassador Vel Karen, would be available for a video conference in 2 hours. It gave a frequency and a protocol. It did not say please. It did not say thank you. It simply stated a time and moved on. The conference room that the human delegation used was a large, plain space in a government building in Geneva that had been hurriedly cleared and prepared over the previous days. There was a long table, and at the far end of the table there was a large screen. Carol Nash sat at the head of the human side of the table. Diana sat 2 seats to her left. There were 6 other people in the room, all of them specialists. A linguist, 2 scientists, an economist, a military advisor, and Paul, who sat near the door and said nothing the entire time. Velkaran appeared on the screen exactly on time. He was tall. The screen made it hard to judge, but later estimates put him at nearly 2.5 meters, with gray skin and 4 arms, 2 of which were folded at his waist and 2 of which rested on the table in front of him. His face was not unreadable, but it required practice to read. Mike and Carol had spent 3 days studying every piece of footage humanity had of non-human biological forms, which was not much but was enough to give her a baseline. He opened the meeting by acknowledging the Human Declaration. He said the Council had noted humanity's position. He said the tone of the Declaration had been registered. Then, without pausing, he said that the terms of the Council's offer were not within the scope of what could be negotiated. They were fixed. The Council was happy, he said, to discuss the timeline for implementation, possible cultural exemptions, and certain administrative details. Those were the variables. The terms themselves were not. He spoke for about 12 minutes. His translator, a device, not a person, rendered everything in clear, flat English. When he finished, he folded his upper hands together and waited. Carol let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Ambassador, before we discuss implementation, I'd like to share some information about Earth that may not be fully represented in your briefing materials. I'll be brief." She was not brief. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not use notes. She spoke in a steady, even voice, and she did not raise it once. She started with Earth's history, not the polished version, not the version about art and science and exploration. She told the version about survival. She described the ice ages, the volcanic winters that had reduced the human population to a few thousand individuals more than once, the pandemics that had killed hundreds of millions of people, and the fact that in every case, humanity had come back. Not slowly, not easily, but completely. She described the world wars. She gave the numbers, the casualty figures, the cities destroyed, the infrastructure that had been reduced to rubble. She described the nuclear weapons that had been used and the weapons that had been built after them, weapons large enough to end all complex life on Earth several times over. She noted carefully that these weapons still existed and that their delivery systems were maintained and that the people responsible for them were very well trained. One of Velkaran's aides, a smaller figure sitting to his left, made a small, quick movement with one hand. Carol saw it. She kept her voice level and continued. She mentioned Calvin's team. She described their work in plain terms. She said it was preliminary. She said it was real. She did not oversell it. She mentioned, and briefly and without any detail, the programs that General Bridges had cataloged. She did not name them. She did not describe them. She said only that they existed and that their full scope was not completely understood even by the people overseeing them, and that this was something humanity was actively working to understand better. Then she put her hands flat on the table and looked at the screen. "Ambassador," she said, "the Council is correct that it could take this planet. We are not saying otherwise, but we would ask you to think carefully about what taking it would cost, and whether that cost is worth what you would receive, which is a civilization that does not trust you, that resents the arrangement it was forced into, and that has, throughout its entire history, treated being told it cannot survive as a reason to try harder." Velkaran looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at something off-screen. Then he looked back. "We will need to recess," he said. The screen went dark. The clock on the wall said it was 11:42 in the morning. Carol picked up her water glass and drank from it. The room was very quiet. Paul, near the door, was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. She set the glass down and looked at the blank screen and waited. The recess lasted 9 hours. For 9 hours, the screen in the conference room in Geneva stayed dark. The human delegation did not leave the building. They ate food that was brought in on trays, they drank coffee, and they waited. Some of them slept on chairs. Paul Warren spent 2 hours standing at a window watching the city outside, which looked completely normal. People walking, cars moving, the lights of shops coming on as the afternoon turned into evening. It was strange, he thought, how normal a city could look when everything was in the process of changing forever. What happened inside the council ships during those 9 hours was not known to the human delegation at the time. They would learn about it later, piece by piece, over the months and years after the agreement was signed, as some of Velkaran's junior staff began, quietly, always off the record, to talk to human researchers and historians. The picture that came together was not what anyone had expected. The Council had 3 ships in orbit, and the most senior staff were on the largest one. There were 14 of them in the main deliberation room. The Council's diplomatic team, their security advisors, and 2 specialists from a division whose function was to model and predict the behavior of new species during contact operations. These specialists had done their jobs very carefully before the mission. They had studied every piece of observable data on humanity. The radio and television signals Earth had been broadcasting into space for 100 years. The patterns of political change, the history of conflicts and their resolutions, the way human societies grew and collapsed and grew again. They had built models, The models had predicted a range of outcomes for the first contact meeting, and every outcome in that range involved humanity eventually, perhaps after some initial friction, accepting the Council's terms. The models had not predicted Carol Nash. More precisely, they had not predicted what she represented. The Council had assessed Earth's military capacity thoroughly. They knew about the nuclear weapons. They had counted the warheads and studied the delivery systems. They had measured the cyber warfare capabilities. They had even flagged in one of their internal reports that Earth possessed a small number of research programs whose purpose was unclear. All of this had been entered into their calculations, and the calculations had still produced the same result. Humanity would resist, protest, and then accommodate, because that was what species did. What Carol's 40 minutes had done, Velkarin's senior advisor later told a human historian, was not change the military calculation. It had changed something harder to quantify, and it had made clear that the humans understood their own history in a way that the Council had not accounted for. Every other species the Council had contacted had been, in some sense, surprised by their own survival. They had come through difficult periods, yes, but they had done it without fully understanding that they were doing it, and when the Council arrived and offered stability and protection, they had received it as a genuine gift. Humanity did not seem surprised by its own survival. Humanity seemed to expect it. And that was a fundamentally different thing to sit across the table from. There was also the matter of the 11 days. The Council's standard contact protocol gave new civilizations between 40 and 90 standard days to review the terms before a delegation arrived, and the distance from the outer solar system to Earth had reduced that window to 11 days, and the Council had considered this a minor logistical issue. Not ideal, but not significant, because the review period was really just a formality. No civilization had ever used the time to do anything other than panic and argue internally. Humanity had used 11 days to begin developing a faster-than-light drive, compile a full inventory of its unconventional military capabilities, form the first genuine political alliance between all of its major nations, and write a joint declaration that was both calm and deeply unsettling in the specific way it was calm. The Council's modeling division had run a retrospective analysis after Carol's presentation and found that if humanity had been given the full 90 days, the outcomes their models had predicted became, in many of the simulation runs, genuinely difficult to forecast. This finding had caused a long and uncomfortable silence in the deliberation room. The debate that followed lasted 7 of the 9 hours. It was not a clean debate. Voices were raised, which was unusual for Council deliberations. The security advisors argued for proceeding with the original terms and using the enforcement protocols if humanity refused to comply. The diplomatic specialists argued against it, not on moral grounds but on practical ones. The enforcement protocols were designed for a species that could be isolated, a species whose leadership could be separated from its general population and pressured individually. Humanity's leadership structure was diffuse, redundant, and had just demonstrated that it could achieve meaningful coordination in 11 days. The enforcement protocols would be slow, expensive, and uncertain in a way they had never been before. Velkarin listened to both sides for a long time before he spoke. When he did speak, he said something simple. He said that the Council's purpose was not to absorb species that resented it. The framework worked because its members participated in it willingly. A member that did not participate willingly was not a member. It was a problem, and problems required resources to manage. The question was not whether Earth could be forced to comply. The question was whether forcing Earth to comply was worth what it would cost to maintain that compliance over decades, over centuries, and against a species that treated being told it could not survive as a reason to try harder. General Bridges, when he learned about this debate many months later, was quiet for a moment. Then he said "good" in a tone that his staff recognized as the highest form of praise he ever gave. When Velkaran's image reappeared on the screen in Geneva, it was nearly 9 in the evening. Carol was sitting at the table with a cup of tea. She looked, to everyone in the room, exactly as calm as she had looked that morning. The screen came on, and Velkaran looked at her from across the camera, and something in his posture was different. Very slightly, just enough for Carol to notice. "We would like," he said, "to discuss the terms of a different arrangement." Carol set down her tea. "Of course," she said. "Oh, we would be glad to." His talks lasted 4 more days. They were held in the same conference room in Geneva, on the same video connection, with the same people sitting on both sides. But the conversations were very different now. Velkaran came to each session with a prepared position, and Carol Nash came with something else, a clear, specific sense of what humanity needed and a patient willingness to explain it as many times as necessary until the council understood. She did not ask for everything. That was one of the first things her team had argued about, in the hours after Velkaran's image had gone dark on the night of the recess. Some of the people in the room had wanted to go in the next morning and demand total equality, a full seat at every table, complete freedom in all areas, no restrictions of any kind. Carol had listened to all of them, and then told them quietly that this was not how agreements worked. An agreement that one side felt it had lost entirely was not an agreement. It was a temporary pause before a new conflict. What she was trying to build was something that would hold. The agreement that was eventually signed, on a Thursday afternoon, in the same room where the talks had begun, with delegations from every human nation seated along the walls as observers, was unlike anything in the Council's long history of contact operations. Velkaran described it to the Council's General Assembly afterward as structurally irregular, but functionally stable. What he meant, in plain language, was that humanity had written most of it themselves, and that the parts the Council had written were much smaller than they had expected. Earth would not become a provisional member civilization. Instead, it would join the Council as what the agreement called a sovereign associate, a category that had never existed before and was created specifically for this occasion. It was not full membership, but it was not the arrangement the Council had originally proposed either. It was something in between, and the space in between was defined in precise detail by 41 pages of text that Carol and her team had drafted over 3 nights. Earth would keep all of its military forces. There would be no peacekeeping auxiliary. There would be no external authority over human soldiers or human weapons. Earth would not be required to apply for authorization before developing faster-than-light technology, artificial intelligence, or any other capability. It would not be required to license off-planet resource extraction through any Council-chartered company. 80% of nothing would go to galactic infrastructure maintenance. Humanity's resources, in space and on Earth, would remain humanity's. In exchange, Carol had written a set of obligations that she considered fair and that she had explained to the Council with the same steady patience she used for everything. Humanity would not start conflicts with Council member worlds. Humanity would share certain agricultural and medical knowledge with pre-contact civilizations in its region of space, knowledge that Earth had developed and that other young worlds could use. Humanity would take part in Council discussions about matters affecting the Sol system. It could request a place in discussions about neighboring systems. And these were not large obligations. They were the obligations of a neighbor, not a subject. There was one more provision. It had been Velkaran's only firm request, and Carol had accepted it without argument, because she agreed with it. A joint observatory would be built and permanently staffed by both humans and Council personnel. Its purpose would be to watch the Sol system for large-scale threats, asteroid events, solar instability, deep space objects on collision courses. Things that humanity's own history had taught it to take seriously. Paul Warren asked Carol about that provision on the evening after the signing, when the two of them were standing outside the building in the cool November air. The streets were quiet. Above the city in the dark sky, 2 of the 3 council ships were visible as moving points of light. Or why did he want that one? Paul asked. Carol looked up at the sky for a moment. Because he read our history, she said, and now he knows what we know, that this planet has tried to kill us before, and it might try again. He wants to know if it does. She paused. Honestly, so do I. Paul was quiet. Then he said, Do you think it holds? The agreement? Carol did not answer right away. She thought about the agreements she had built over 40 years, the ones that had fallen apart and the ones that had not. And what had made the difference? The ones that held were not the ones where everyone was happy. They were the ones where everyone had a clear, honest understanding of what it would cost to walk away from them. Yes, she said. I think it holds. The council ships left orbit 3 days later. They did not leave without acknowledgement. Velkaran sent a short, formal message to Diana Cole before departure, thanking the human delegation for its cooperation and expressing the council's expectation of a productive long-term relationship. Diana read the message and wrote a short, formal reply. Then she went and found a quiet room and sat in it alone for a few minutes, which was the closest she came to celebrating. In the months that followed, historians and journalists began trying to write the story of what had happened. They interviewed everyone they could find. They filed requests for documents. They built timelines. The picture that emerged was complicated and, in some places, still incomplete. But the part that got talked about most, the part that appeared in documentaries and school lessons and late-night conversations all over the world, was a single paragraph from a report that Velkaran had submitted to the Council's General Assembly after returning home. The paragraph had been partially declassified at humanity's request, as part of an early exchange of historical documents between Earth and the Council. It read, They are not a threat in the way the word is usually meant. They do not want to conquer anything. They do not share a single belief or a single goal. What they share is something smaller and harder to measure, a very deep unwillingness to accept any condition as permanent. Their planet has told them, many times and in many ways, that they are small and fragile and temporary. They have heard this and declined to agree. I recommend the Council proceed with full awareness of this. Diana Cole read the paragraph on a printed sheet of paper that someone had left on her desk. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Then she picked up a piece of tape and stuck the paper to the wall above her desk, between a map of the solar system and a photograph of her family. She never took it down.